Hey YouTube, I'm Chaplain B and welcome back to my channel, Keep Calm and Call the Chaplain, where we talk about all things spiritual care practice. I've been hooked on HBO Max's The Pitt ever since the start of the season. Each time I watch the show, I think about my own experiences as a spiritual care provider, someone who has done rounds and circulated in all kinds of contexts, and this show just brings up all kinds of memories and all kinds of ideas. As I'm watching this incredibly realistic show, I can't help but pick up on things from my unique perspective as a board certified chaplain, and in today's video I'm going to give you a kind of window into the things that I'm thinking about as a spiritual care provider. Now this is going to be a kind of spiritual clinical picture of what goes into my assessments when I'm circulating and when I'm interacting with patients and staff. The way I want to do this is I want to focus on a storyline involving Dr. Cassie McKay and third-year medical student Victoria Javadi. And this storyline really hasn't gotten much attention. But this dynamic between them is important to talk about because it involves the sometimes complicated dynamic of working under direct supervision, something I know that we've all experienced. My hope in offering you all of this is that you'll gain a greater awareness around professional chaplaincy, and maybe some of what I offer to you might resonate with you and your story. I'd like this to be a conversation. Please feel free to place your comments and thoughts and reactions in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. For a little background information, the series is broken down into hours, where each episode represents 1 hour in the shift. At the beginning of the shift, we learn that Dr. Robbie doesn't usually work on this day because it's the anniversary of the death of a close friend and mentor. And this catches everyone by surprise. Now, when I learned that, I immediately knew that if I were one of the spiritual care providers on the team, I would want to spend some extra time in this department just to provide a little support if needed. In the early part of the shift, Dr. Robbie repeatedly says he's fine. I know that he's human. I know that these shifts are challenging, and so it would be critically important for me to be present and provide a little bit of extra support. This is critically important because Dr. Robbie is in a position of trust and in a position of power. He's the attending. He also directly supervises residents and medical students. Everything is under his responsibility. And so his responses to situations directly impact the rest of the team. Leadership, after all, is an emotional process, and if leaders don't have good awareness around their internal world, it's going to end up making their decisions for them. And sure enough, throughout the rest of the season or throughout the rest of the shift, we see Dr. Robbie's past appearing in various ways in the moment, to include directly influencing the way Dr. McKay interacts with the student that she's supervising, Victoria Javadi. Let's watch this first major interaction between Dr. McKay and Victoria, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit further.
My son always comes first no matter what.
Yeah.
Even if it means I have to do without. I know I'm a doctor, right? How bad could it be? But I used to be an addict. Even lost custody of my kid.
I never would have guessed.
Yeah. I went through some really dark times before I finally got help. And I've been sober now. 9 years, 5 months, and 11 days. It was the last couple weeks.
Yeah, I'm on.
Thank you.
Thanks. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
Has Kiara been here yet?
No, who's Kiara?
Oh, she's the hospital social worker. She can help you out with like housing and childcare and food and
You
security.
told her?
No,
No, it's all free. The system works if you use it.
I now have to. I don't need your help. Nice speech. Next time, mind your own business.
You ever heard of impact over intent?
I would never intentionally embarrass anybody.
But you did. You didn't have a conversation with Sherry or ask her what she needed. Instead, you walked in here and told her what to do. You gotta slow down, take a beat, and listen instead of judging people.
I don't judge.
Please, you've been eyeing me sideways all day. Look, maybe I have a better perspective because I've been on both sides, but we gotta try to at least put ourselves in their shoes. Listening and building trust will make us better doctors and better people.
As I mentioned earlier, in organizations that have positions of power, there are often parallels between these positions. What a parallel means is that one impacts the other. Let's start first with Dr. McKay's statement about impact over intent. Now, this phrase is a concept in interpersonal communication where the consequence of what was said and done is prioritized over the intent behind it. For example, you may have intended one thing, but if it had a certain impact on someone else, then it doesn't matter what you intended. The reality is perhaps the thing shouldn't have been said or done because of the impact that it had on someone else. Earlier, Dr. Robbie stresses to the hospital administrator this exact concept. He tells the hospital administrator, listen, the intent behind all these changes you're making is to save costs, but the impact that it's having on the staff, on patient care, and so on, it's having a negative impact. Well, then he ends up learning later on about a patient's son who expressed an intent to harm others. Dr. Robbie in that moment chooses not to report that because his intent is not to ruin this boy's life, as he says. But then this ends up clashing with Dr. McKay, who brings the impact of that decision to Dr. Robbie's attention. Ironically, in this scene, Dr. McKay's intent in getting on to Victoria is to make her a better doctor, so she says. But you can see that the impact that this has on Javadi's sense of belonging and sense of being a part of the team is a negative one, and it further alienates her from being a part of the system. In an anxious system, if individuals don't have good self-awareness, then this anxiety ball just keeps circulating around in different forms through the different parallels. That being said, let me zoom into a problematic issue that I see with Dr. McKay's provision of care, and this is blurred boundaries. All providers have ethical guidelines that help us provide care in a way that honors the dignity, the respect, and the rights of those in our care and in our charge. There's a time and place for appropriate self-disclosure, but I assess that Dr. McKay is struggling with this, and I know this because she's disclosing things like her past drug use, she's showing the patient her ankle monitor, and in fact, before she even did that, she looked around to see who was watching. And another real clear way that I know that Dr. McKay crossed an ethical boundary with appropriate self-disclosure is that, although it's not in this scene, the patient begins to caretake the doctor, asking her how her son is doing and how they're getting along. So in that moment, when the patient ends up being the helper and the doctor becomes the help seeker, you know that a boundary has been crossed. In my view, the hospital clinical social worker, Kiara, would have been an excellent resource to take the lead on this really delicate conversation. And another good resource would have also been to consult with the chaplain. The way that Dr. McKay's blurred boundaries ends up showing up is in how she reacted once the patient was gone. In interpersonal relationships, when a person has a blurred sense of boundaries, they can end up moving toward putting others into a type of triangle. Often this takes the form of villain and victim and hero. And we clearly see that here, where Dr. McKay places Sherry, or the patient, into the victim position. She gets upset about that. She becomes the hero because she's trying to orchestrate a plan to get Sherry some resources, and that's understandable. But then Victoria is placed in the villain position in this anxious triangle. Dr. McKay is a supervisor, and instead what she should be doing is, instead of being pulled into this anxious dynamic, She should be able to remain differentiated and coach, mentor, and train those in her charge. And what this would look like is perhaps saying something like, Victoria, I want to check in with you. I know what it feels like to have patients upset with you, and I know that that's not a great feeling, so how are you doing? Another option is, in my experience, when we choose to fix problems instead of listening to people, that can come across as uncaring or worse, judgmental. I want to hear from you. How did you experience this whole situation with the patient? So notice how, as a mentor, I model what that looks like first by checking in with the mentee, and then utilize that moment as a training opportunity. And in a position of power like Dr. McKay's, you really want to be sensitive to that power imbalance. And one of the ways that you do that is by using tentative language. Be aware of what else could be true. It's not a great feeling when someone, especially in a position of power, tells you what your motive is. Like here when Dr. McKay says, you're being judgmental, you're judging me, and so on. But in my assessment, there's a reason why Dr. McKay wasn't able to stay present, and instead she got lost in the moment. And that's because of the next thing that I observed in this dynamic. Her story is showing up. Let's watch the next clip.
Will I be able to see?
That's why you need surgery. The ophthalmologist will drain the blood inside the front of your eye and replace it with the clear fluid you need to see. Okay? We're ready for you now.
Hey. Don't worry, bud. All right? So he has the surgery, stays overnight, he goes home tomorrow?
It depends on how the surgery goes and what his post-op results are like.
Give or take.
It could be as soon as tomorrow, yeah.
Okay. So he could be game ready by Thursday. Huh?
Sir, your son is freaking out because he may never see out of his left eye again.
Yeah, that's...
No, forget baseball. Just be his dad.
So now might be a good time to go over some doctor-patient interaction guidelines.
Sorry, that dad was just such
so
an
overbearing. Sorry. Look, do I think he needed to chill out a little bit? Yes. But he's a parent, and this might be his way of coping with the stress of a very frightening situation.
I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me.
No, I do. You and that baseball kid are two pressure cooker prodigies in a pod. Just, as physicians, we gotta learn to keep our emotions in check and not let our personal experiences interfere with our professional responsibilities.
This is interesting advice because she's both absolutely 100% right, but she's also guilty of doing the very thing that she's telling Victoria not to do. Case in point, why did Dr. McKay cross some ethical boundaries with the last patient? Well, it's because the patient touched on a vulnerable part of her story, and she ended up sharing some of that story or oversharing some of that story with the patient. The patient didn't know that she had touched on a vulnerable part of Dr. McKay's story. Victoria didn't know that, and perhaps Dr. McKay didn't even know that in the moment, but there it was. The vulnerable part of her story was coming out, and it was even influencing her provision of care. Based on all of this spiritual clinical picture data, I assessed two things. First, the entire system, from the administrator to the attending, to the residents, to the students, and the patients, and then the patients, to the students, to the residents, to the attending, to the administrator, all of them are in one giant parallel process, each one impacting the other. Chaplain clinicians are trained to not just see issues within group dynamics, but they're also trained to apply interventions at a systemic level. Second, I assessed that Dr. McKay's spiritual presenting problem is a lack of boundaries stemming from her unresolved parts of her story, which are impacting her work and connections to others, as we saw in the first clip. This may also be responsible for influencing how Javadi reacted to the patient's father in the second clip. Again, in this system, they're all connected and they all influence one another. And in Victoria's case, she's learning from Dr. McKay how to be a physician. In this hypothetical situation, as an intervention, I would start first with awareness. Part of my theoretical orienting system is the belief that once we have awareness around a dynamic, we can make choices about it in the moment. I would conduct a type of spiritual exploration with Dr. McKay, time permitting, and I would explore her thoughts and feelings in the moment as she responded to Victoria in the first clip. And what I would then do is unpack where all that energy came from in her spiritual history and story, because it's showing up in the present moment. And perhaps Dr. McKay is unaware of how her story was showing up in this patient visit and how it even caused her to blur some boundaries that she had with the patient interaction. Thank you for checking out my channel, and if you found this video informative, please hit the like and subscribe button to help this channel grow. Thank you for being you, and thank you for